Welcome back to Threads of Evil, the podcast where we untangle the darkest fibers of humanity, one thread at a time. I'm your host, and today we're delving deep into the mind of a man whose crimes chilled the very bones of the Soviet Union. His name is Andrei Chikatilo, but history remembers him as the Butcher of Rostov. He's one of the most prolific serial killers in history. A man's horrific crime spree claimed at least 52 lives, though some believe the number is even higher. His crimes spanned over a decade, a time during which fear became a constant companion for families across Russia and the Soviet Union. But how does a man like Chikatilo come to be? What makes a seemingly ordinary schoolteacher transform into one of the most sadistic, evil predators the world has ever known? Let's unravel that thread. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was born on October 16, 1936, in the small village of Yabloncha, Ukraine, then at that time part of the Soviet Union. His childhood was marked by war, famine, and trauma. Breeding grounds, some would say, perhaps for a serial killer. His family lived in utter poverty, and stories from his early years are soaked in blood and in hunger. It is said that during the Holodomor, the Soviet-induced famine of the 1930s, Chikatilo's older brother, Stepan, was kidnapped and eaten by starving neighbors. But of course, there's no official confirmation of this story. But even rumors like that can shape the world a child grows up in. Even a story like that could perhaps slowly start to explain why this killer became the butcher that he was known as, the Butcher of Rostov. Having that kind of background already, you see that it's diving into where he already has a troubled childhood. Now, of course, not everybody that has a troubled childhood leads up to serial killing and whatnot, but this helps us understand the mindset that Chikatilo perhaps had and how he coped with that trauma. Because obviously, there's some of us that are listening to this that obviously have childhood trauma, and you're perfectly fine. Though there's probably some that aren't perfectly fine. And I mean, I myself have had childhood trauma and messed up childhood, but I also didn't resort to becoming a serial killer. So that's not always the case or situation. But the background, if you will, for Chikatilo or any of these serial killers that I talked about on this podcast, it helps set the state of mind that the person had that led them to the actions of how they dealt with those situations in their life. So Chikatilo's father fought in World War II and was later captured by Nazis, becoming a prisoner of war. When he returned home, he was seen as a traitor, a stain on the family. Young Andrei grew up isolated, bullied, and deeply ashamed. So apparently, I guess because he was, captured by the Nazis, a lot of people in the area that Chikatilo grew up in, they consider the guy a traitor. I don't. I mean, this guy served his country and, fought for what he believed is right and fought against evil like the Nazis. He was a hero. But apparently the people in that part of the Soviet Union disagreed and didn't think so. They're wrong, of course. I mean, I don't know why they would do such a thing, but unfortunately because of what happened with his father, the sins of the father were passed on to the son, I guess is the old saying, if you will. And then there was another source of shame that followed him into adulthood, his sexual dysfunction. Chikatilo experienced impotence, and his inability to perform sexually became a defining point of humiliation in his early life. It's believed that this sexual repression and frustration would eventually intertwine with his homicidal desires. And this is a common thread, if you will, in, serial killer or people with this kind of background, is they look for a way to, with the sexual impotence, he probably felt like he was lesser than, or he felt in this kind of need to prove his importance, to prove how strong and masculine he was. And so this comes from a toxic masculinity kind of thing, because men are taught from this toxic masculinity point of view that you have to be a certain way, and certain things define you as a man. And so for men, part of what supposedly defines them as men in toxic masculinity environment is, that right there, the penis, if you will. That's the symbol of masculinity. And so in that particular situation where that is taken away, obviously Chikatilo had to find another way, if you will, to assert his dominance, to assert his masculinity. And of course, this leads to this toxic potential and potentiality of what led, Chikatilo down this path, if you will, if that makes sense. See, because as you know, within the mindset of toxic masculinity, in order to prove your masculinity, if you will, is your ability to perform sexually. And for that to be robbed of Chikatilo, he didn't have any way in that kind of mindset that was at the time period of that this happened to show that he was masculine and that he was a strong man, because that, in essence, had been robbed from him, or at least in his set of mind. And this is the kind of thinking that toxic masculinity can lead to. And this is where the seed is planted. Trauma, repression, and isolation, all wrapped in a crumbling Soviet society that didn't talk about feelings, didn't offer therapy, and turned a blind eye to the strange and the broken. Because they had no kind of set thing to deal with this kind of thing, where men or anybody could go to therapy, if you will. It was the whole men just deal with it kind of situation. I mean, we have that kind of situation, if you will, now setting up in the United States of America, a similar situation. And I'm not saying it'll lead to this, but it could possibly lead to something similar to, Chikatilo, because when you don't deal with these emotions and you repress them, they have to find a way out, if you will, find a way to lash out. And kind of in Chikatilo's situation, that's what happens when you turn a blind eye to the strange and the broken. You lead to toxic situations, you lead to massacres, you lead to school shootings, you lead to all these kind of things because you don't focus on the mental health, if you will. So despite his troubled background, though, Chikatilo earned a university degree and eventually became a school teacher, but it didn't take long for troubling behavior to emerge. So despite all this, he was able to get his degree. So he was able to repress the emotion, to repress this, thing that was bubbling inside of him only for a while. Because, see, students reported strange incidences. Chikatilo watching them in the bathroom, touching them inappropriately, and even openly fondling himself in class. Yet, time and time again, he was quietly dismissed rather than reported. A pattern of systematic failure we've seen with far too many predators is that the system fails. The system is not perfect. I've noticed in a lot of other podcasts that deals with true crime or deals with this kind of topic that we're dealing with in this, is they make it seem like that it wasn't the system that failed, that there's a serial killer and crime around every corner. But in reality, the policing system, the judicial system is not perfect at all in any way whatsoever, and fails people time and time again, and helps create the situations that lead to these crimes. But the thing is the whole crime being rampant around every corner is not true. These are, very strange and odd cases and not the norm. Anyways, sorry, rambling. So he married and had 2 children, living a double life, father by day, monster in the shadows. But Chikatilo couldn't contain his urges forever. And in 1978, he snapped, and he made his first kill. Her name was Lena Zatkanova. She was just 9 years old, only 9 years old. So his first victim, just the nature of this crime, the fact that it was just so young is disturbing. So he lured her into an abandoned house, promising her candy.
Once inside, he attacked her. The assault turned to murder, a frenzied, chaotic killing that shocked even him. He stabbed her repeatedly and mutilated her body and threw her into a nearby river. Now, for the Soviet Union at that point, this was really shocking because up to that point, they didn't really have this kind of crime in these particular situations, or at least it wasn't reported. But it even shocked him. Like, he himself was even shocked by the cruelty, the evil that he was capable of. And here's the chilling part. Someone else was arrested for the crime. A man named Alexander Kravchenko, who had a criminal record and was coerced into confessing. He was eventually executed for a murder he didn't commit. And so Chikatilo walked free, emboldened, invisible. He thought nothing could touch him and no one would ever find out because they executed the wrong person. The police arrested this person like, yeah, you did the crime, because they didn't want to face the situation that they had something loose on their hands. They didn't want to admit it because they believed their system was perfect. They believed that, they would always get the killer, they would always catch the criminal and deal with it, and there was no, thing going on like that. They wanted to believe that their police force was perfect and that they didn't help create a situation like, Chikatilo and all this crime, right? Over the next 12 years, Chikatilo would kill again and again. He preyed on the vulnerable. Young boys, young girls, runaways, vagrants. Victims society wouldn't miss. Victims that helped him blend in and hide in plain sight. Victims that society had forgotten, that the society wanted to ignore because the Soviet Union had this idea to create this image that their society was perfect and that they were a utopia. So they would ignore these kind of people because ignoring them made it easier for them to believe they lived in a utopia. To address that the victims of Chikatilo, they helped put these victims in that particular situation of, being, these people, the forgotten people, vulnerable vagrants, people that society wouldn't miss. They would have to admit that their society wasn't perfect and that they hadn't created a utopia. So in order to even address that these people existed, not just that they were victims of Chikatilo, but to admit that they exist would mean that they would have to reform their system and realize that there were plenty of people in their society that were poor, were living in poverty, were the forgotten, and they would have to admit that their particular type of economic system and government had failed the most vulnerable people because they had allowed this kind of situation, and that their society wasn't perfect, and that they would have parts of their society that they would have to address in order to reform their government and their country to be a better place. Anyways, point being, he developed a pattern: lure, isolate, mutilate, and discard. He stabbed his victims dozens of times. Often he would remove their eyes. Believing the last image they saw was burned into them, he mutilated genitals, bit off nipples, and cannibalized parts. So he would actually... his way of destroying the evidence was cannibalism. And every time, he grew more comfortable, more brazen, because he's like, they're never going to catch me. They're never going to find me. I can continue to commit these crimes, and no one ever is going to catch me. Because that's what he had came to, because they had already suspected one person of his first murder, and they executed this person wrongfully. But the bodies were piling up. And the Soviet authorities couldn't ignore them forever. They had been ignoring it to a certain point, but they couldn't ignore it forever. It was too rampant. It was too all over the place. There couldn't be this cover-up that they wanted. The investigation became one of the largest in Soviet history. Over 1,000 suspects were interviewed. Dozens were arrested. Some even falsely confessed. But Chikatilo just stayed outside their grasp. So yeah, they forced confessions out of thousands of these people that they believed were the suspect, because they were so desperate to cover up, to stop it, instead of addressing the issues that caused it in the first place, to address that their society wasn't perfect. They just wanted to brush it off to the side and have it be forgotten. And when a society does that and brushes it off, instead of finding actual justice, then the system has failed. The system has failed when they don't address the issues that lead to this, and they don't find the actual people. They don't have any way to focus on mental health. This is the kind of situation that it leads to, and it'll lead to it every time. In 1990, after years of dead ends, the net began to close. a new profiler had joined the investigation, Viktor Barkov. Inspired by Western criminal profiling, he believed they were looking for someone intelligent, educated, and socially awkward, but not a manic in the traditional sense, but someone hiding in plain sight. And that's exactly what they found. In November of 1990, Chikatilo was spotted acting suspiciously at a train station, a known hunting ground of his. He was detained and interrogated. At first, he denied everything, but after hours of questioning, and when forensic evidence began to line up, Chikatilo confessed. Not to just 1 or 2 murders, but to over 50. And it's surprising because, I wonder if they, at the time, thought that the confession that they got out of him was not an actual confession, because they had already failed multiple times over 1,000 suspects that confessed and weren't the actual culprit. And so I wonder if the detective at the time, or at least the one that took over the investigation, he was like, I don't know if this is an actual confession, because you dumb fucks got multiple confessions out of people that weren't actually the criminal, because you just wanted to brush it under the rug and forget it instead of addressing the issues that needed to be addressed. So it makes one wonder, if you will, that if at any point they were wondering if Chikatilo's confession was actually true, because they'd already had thousands of people, that gave false confessions, and these people were not at all, the actual suspect. His confessions were haunting, cold, detail, and devoid of remorse. He described his crimes like a butcher would describe cuts of meat. And that's probably why he became known as the Butcher of Rostov, because he just acted like it was nothing. He had no remorse. He lacked the compassion. Whether he ever had that, who knows? Maybe he was a sociopath and lacked the ability to understand the emotion behind what he was doing. Or maybe over a period of abuse and a corrupt childhood, it robbed him of that. We won't know, because that particular society at the time, the Soviet Union, did not address these kind of things. So we'll never know if he ever actually had the emotion or actually had the ability to comprehend that what he was doing was wrong and actually have remorse. Because we'll never know if it's the fact that the Soviet Union refused to address this at the time and they could have prevented it. Or if he was always like this. We won't know, because the record keeping sucked as well, too. In 1992, Chikatilo went to trial. The courtroom was a circus. Families screamed, fainted, cursed. Chikatilo sat in a metal cage, raving and rambling, and occasional shouting nonsense. But make no mistake, he was sane, and he was guilty. And he probably tried to do the insanity thing, acting crazy, because they thought he was like, if I act crazy, maybe they'll let me off, and I'll get put in a mental institution, and they won't put me in an actual prison where I actually belong. But of course that didn't work. He was found responsible for 52 murders, and he was sentenced to death. On February 14th, 1994, he was executed with a single gunshot behind the ear. A quiet end to a life that had brought chaos, terror, and murder. But his crimes left deep scars on the families, on the investigators, and on a country struggling to understand how such an evil could go unnoticed for so long. So what do we make of a man like Andrei Chikatilo? Was he a product of a brutal society? A victim of repression and war? Or was he always broken, destined to become a killer? These questions, they don't have a clear answer to it, And I mean, it could have been addressed perhaps if they had actually focused on the mental health and realized there were other important things to focus on as well, other than the things they were focusing on as a country. But one thing is clear, the system failed at every turn. From his early warning signs as a teacher, to the wrongful conviction of an innocent man, and of innocent men in general. Chikatilo's story isn't just about him. It's about what happens when institutions ignore the warnings and when horror hides behind respectability. It's about the evil that grows in silence. And that's why we tell these stories, to make sure silence doesn't win. And also to make sure that we see the warning signs. So the Soviet Union didn't see the warning signs. And it led to these brutal murders and left so many families traumatized and never probably to be able to recover from such vicious and horrible crimes.
If they would have perhaps focused on mental health, maybe it was a mental health issue and it could have been solved. Or if it wasn't and it was something else, maybe they could have caught him in time. If they were willing to address the flaws within their society and realize certain things, maybe they could have learned from this and built a better society instead. But yeah, like I said, that's why we tell these stories, to make sure silence doesn't win, to make sure we prevent other Andrei Chikatilos before it gets out of control, before it leads to such horrible things. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life and crimes of the Butcher of Rostov. If you found this episode disturbing, good. You're supposed to. These aren't bedtime stories. These are warnings. These are ways for us to observe human nature, to observe and to see why these things happen. You've been listening to Threads of Evil. I'm your host, and remember, the threads are always there. All we have to do is follow them. Until next time, stay safe out there. The threads are evil, are closer than you think.